Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine put together by all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas, and make sure you tune in as we bring you coverage of the 400th anniversary of Virginia's founding, when we threw off the idea of collectivism because we were all starving to death and started the very first House of the General Assembly 400 years ago in Jamestown. Brought to you by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Our first guest this week, believe it or not, is right in the middle of where we stand 400 years later as Virginia tries to grapple with this idea of gerrymandering. Michael Watson is research director at the Capital Research Center. He's written a great column and a book about the myth of nonpartisan districts. Michael, welcome to the program. How are you doing this week?
Thank you. I'm doing quite well.
We've gone back and forth with this. Back and forth with a group called One Virginia 2021, which is one of the groups pushing nonpartisan commissions on redistricting. First, it was going to be bipartisan, and then I pointed out how dangerous it would be to elevate the Republican and Democratic parties to a level as anointed by a position in the government, ostensibly codifying them as the fourth and fifth branch of government, and they backed off that.
And if you did that, you would be taking inspiration from New Jersey, which wouldn't be where I would take inspiration for ethics in government.
Yeah, absolutely. No good governance comes from New Jersey. My goodness. So, Michael. So let's backtrack to how we get here and how we wind up having this debate about gerrymandering, because I remember when they beat the Voting Rights Act in the Supreme Court, or at least the pre-clearance, and I said, be careful what you wish for, guys. Everyone was heralding it as a victory. I said, it's funny because the pre-clearance made it very clear that these districts had to keep from separating ethnic communities.
Right. I think we should go back even many steps further than that, all the way back to the 1800s.
Okay, great.
The way that the congressional districts are drawn, how it is decided, whether your representative is this guy or whether your representative is the other guy, is and has historically been, with a few exceptions, by a single-member district. Now, naturally, whoever decides where exactly the lines are drawn may do so for their own advantage. If you put more of, this constituency in this district, that may benefit you in another district. This is as old as the American Republic. Even the word gerrymandering gives away how old the practice is. It's named for Elbridge Gerry, former, I think he was governor of Massachusetts. I think he was vice president under, might have been Madison, way back in the early 19th century. So this has gone on for as long as we have been electing representatives to the U.S. Congress and to state legislatures by geographic constituencies, by geographic districts that aren't established by some other arbitrary system, like that's a state and it has a certain number of senators.
Right. So we go back and it actually addresses to a degree how it's apportioned, and some of this debate about the census, who gets counted, do they get to be counted if they're just here, if they're here and they're not supposed to be here, are they citizens, so on and so forth, comes down to how these districts get meted out and who has the most population, but it's ambiguous as to how large those populations should be. And I guess that was what was interpreted. I think it was 1914 when the House voted, and it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's just simply a law that says,
it used to be that every census, the House grew. It added it added a number of members. If you go back far enough, they're adding states, so that adds new members. But I want to say it was 29 in the late 1920s. they passed a law that said there will be 435 members.
Right,
and
exactly.
They will be, and that's just a statute. That's not part of the Constitution.
Because the room was not big enough for many more. If I'm not mistaken, that was the argument, was that the room was getting too crowded.
It may have been, but now what happens is every 10 years the census is conducted. Depending on what the state population is, you get awarded a certain number of representatives. The Supreme Court, certainly for state legislatures, and I think for U.S. representatives as well, has interpreted the 14th Amendment to require that those districts be of roughly equal population.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, we end up with modern congressional redistricting, where we have to assign who's in which district.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you bring up that capping, and this has been a puzzlement to me, and I don't want to get off your columns, but it's been a puzzlement to me that we can have 3 times as many Americans in the same size number of representatives. And I talk to Democrats and Republicans alike, and there's a feeling of underrepresentation, a distance between the representatives and the representors. Am I just seeing it too obviously that that's a problem?
No. I mean, there are people who advocate for the House to be expanded, for and the addition of new representatives. It would make redistricting might make it somewhat less contentious. It's harder to move people around if the allocations are small, if the number of people in a district is smaller. But I mean, you're still gonna have that. But I can see where some of that stuff, where some of that thought that maybe the districts are too big is coming from.
Right. Well, because Virginia's Constitution actually uses the phrase compact and contiguous, but as you start to expand out, and Virginia's in the same point where it's capped its representative members, you start to expand these districts in order to get everyone into them, in order to match population growth. I just feel like you're almost causing a problem. Wouldn't be the first time that government has caused a problem that it then insists that it's the only one equipped to save us from.
Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately the government, and this was part of Chief Justice Roberts' decision in the congressional redistricting cases, is that ultimately who should be the representatives, who should be the legislature, and how it should be apportioned is ultimately political. And, this is the government. But no, yeah, would not be the first time that in the attempt to fix the errors of a past legislation or a past regulation that the government, tried to go chasing its tail. And
Is what they're trying to do here in Virginia with an appointed commission, and I've wondered this as well, and we talk about mythos of nonpartisan redistricting, the idea that you could have a nonpartisan commission appointed by partisans is, how foolish do they think we are?
Here's the thing with the nonpartisan redistricting commissions or independent redistricting commissions. You have, I mentioned New Jersey earlier, they have a partisan commission that has a certain number of Republicans, a certain number of Democrats, and then if they can't agree, which they never can, then a tiebreaker is appointed. California has a citizens, I'm making air quotes with my fingers, redistricting commission that is supposedly designed to prevent either political party from having the ability to draw districts to benefit itself. Now, when I ran this experiment in redistricting reform, looking at the state by state, how the representation that ultimately went to Congress compared to a system of proportional representation that is used by other democratic countries, the European Union. Israel uses a modified form of it. Other European countries for their national elections use a modified form of it. And comparing how the ultimate state delegations to Congress differed from that control, the proportional representation control. what we found was that California, at least in the current Congress, and even throughout, because we looked at from 2010 through 2018 elections, for most of that period, California, with its independent redistricting commission, sent a delegation that was more biased in favor of the Democrats than Texas, which has conventional partisan legislative redistricting, sent a delegation biased towards Republicans. So in 2018, California sent 10 more Democrats to the U.S. House of Representatives than would have been proportional. And Texas, I believe it was 4 more Republicans than would have been proportional.
Interesting. So what do you... aside from the fact that it's human nature to try to protect one's job, what are some of the good fixes you've found? Once we kind of get ourselves past the idea that somehow mystically we can find, these sanctified souls that would do this without the idea of political gain. What would be a good?
I think the key is to understand that whatever is going to happen is going to be political. Now, what's interesting is that you can do redistricting in such a way that it ends up later in a 10-year census cycle backfiring on you. The examples are New Jersey and your home state of Virginia.
Yeah.
In Virginia, there's been a little bit of, I know there's been some judicial repositioning of the boundaries, but as things have changed from 2010. Think about what was important in 2010. In political debates, you're talking about Obamacare, debt and deficits, compared to now where you're talking about, immigration, national identity. That plays differently in different parts of Virginia, and as a result, what was for the U.S. House of Representatives, a district lines that favored the Republicans, even after the judicial redraw, now those districts that even after the judicial redraw were still Republican tilting, now return more Democrats than would be proportional.
Interesting.
In New Jersey, where they didn't have a legislative redraw or a judicial redraw, it's even more pronounced. And again, we can think about why this might be. If you are a homeowner in a high tax state, which New Jersey is probably it's in top 3, if not the highest tax state, the way that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act changed some of the deductions was not necessarily in your favor. And combine that with the change in some of the other political debates that applied in Virginia, as a result, what was a map that was neutral to slightly Republican favoring now returns 4 more Democrats. Of 11 representatives, there are now 4 more Democrats than you would get under a proportional representation. So as politics changes over a decennial census cycle, the effects of district lines change.
What would, and I know that we've discussed this at length here in the Commonwealth, there have been some collegiate attempts at creating computer modeling and things like that that would draw the districts, without the input of humans, as if something could be like that.
But humans are going to set the parameters that those models are going to use. Are you going to include, whether you include, do you have to keep counties consistent? Do you have to keep towns consistent? Well, that's a political decision, and it defines the parameters under which the computer is going to draw the legislative district. The thing about a single-member district system, which both the United States for the House of Representatives, with the exception of Maine, which has a slightly weird system, and Virginia for its state legislature, with a single-member district system elected by plurality voting, by first past the post, by whoever gets the most votes wins, whether they get a majority or not. is that you actually should not expect the legislature that is returned to be precisely proportional to the statewide or the nationwide vote. If that does happen, and interestingly, our finding was that despite all this redistricting, at the national level for the House of Representatives, it was very, very close to what the state-by-state proportional representation would give you, at least for the 2018 election. You should not necessarily expect that. There are innate effects from having a single-member district system. If you're maxing out your votes in even independently fairly drawn districts that are overwhelmingly support one party, then that hurts you. There is a little bit of a regionalist bias. Now, so again, you're discussing, drawing the districts. Well, let's look at Illinois. Illinois before 2010 had a slight Republican bias. Now it has a slight Democratic bias. Why? Well, a lot of the districts around Chicago were drawn by the Democratic legislature and the Democratic governor to move to put more Chicago and Cook County voters in these suburban districts. Is that fairer? Is that less fair? That's a political decision. And so if you're talking about, well, we're going to do it by algorithm, well, do we need to keep Cook County together? Because that's going to be a political benefit probably to the suburban interests, who at least in 2010 were Republicans. Or is it to match the statewide vote, which means that that Cook County and Chicago are going to be what the term is bacon-mandered, because it looks like strips of bacon when you look at the map. Okay, if you bacon-mander Chicago, you're going to get more Democrats, and maybe that matches more closely the statewide vote. That's a political decision. And that is what Chief Justice Roberts, I think, was trying to get through in his decision on the congressional case, that the Supreme Court cannot sit there on high and make that decision as to whether Cook County should be an integral thing that has representation within itself, or whether the Illinois statewide vote should be matched as closely as possible. Now, in 2018, it did not match as closely as possible. It became Democrat favoring. But again, that gets back to the point I was making about New Jersey, where you have changes in political dynamics, changes in population movements, and that essentially overrides by attrition even the most sophisticated gerrymandering.
Well, and I've seen in several instances, and I think some of this comes down to just the way these guys sit there on a Sunday morning and try to tell you who's going to win the football games that haven't started yet. Here in the 5th Congressional District, longtime, very popular local boy, had been a Democrat, had been a Republican, lost to a Democrat in what is supposedly a heavily gerrymandered Republican plus district. And then in a county in Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia, part of what they called the Red Wall, where, the red part of Pennsylvania begins and the blue part of Philadelphia ends, Republican was trounced by a Democrat for the first time since the Civil War. But in both cases, it was more about the politicians than it was the who had been drawn into the district and what percentages.
And that's an effect. I mean, even in my analysis of this, I had to compensate for that, right? Because in Florida, you used to have a very strong, independent South Florida political identity in the House of Representatives, and Florida doesn't report uncontested races. So, what if you had applied a proxy race, like a Senate race,
Mm-hmm.
it would have looked like the district lines super favored Republicans in a way that is kind of misleading. What in fact was happening was that these local representatives with a strong independent brand were holding on. Now in 2018 they didn't, but up until that point they were holding on, and they were holding on their own merit rather than because of the district lines, and that was evidenced when one of them retired. And one of them was defeated in the 2018 elections as the politics of South Florida changed.
Right, and that's what I think is taken out of this debate is this idea that it squarely on the shoulder of candidates that can reach out and grasp voters. This is one of the reasons I blanched at the idea of putting Democrats and Republicans onto these commissions. I said, then we should have the Whigs and the Tories as well, since those were the parties. The Democrats and Republicans didn't exist when this country was created. So why give them a permanence that I don't think any political party deserves?
No, but again, that tells you how it is about how important it is that the rules are what they are. If we, in my report, the control I used was a proportional system, which would have essentially had people voting for parties instead of voting for candidates. And if that actually were adopted, what I can say with confidence, based on what politics looks like in places that use a proportional representation system, is that the two-party system, as we know it, would cease to exist.
Interesting.
Because people, right now, most voters want to vote for a candidate with a chance of winning. Therefore, they vote for a major party candidate. They vote for a Democrat or they vote for a Republican. In a proportional system, there would be third-party candidates with a chance of winning. There would be third-party candidates who could get elected. In our simulation, I had third-party candidates getting enough votes to at least one third-party candidate getting enough votes to win election in every election since 2010.
Interesting, and that's all.
And that's just based on current votes. That's just based on people protest voting in today's elections. If you said that there was a chance that a libertarian could be elected, that a socialist party could be elected, that a conservative party could be elected, that would change voter behavior, that would change campaign behavior, and that would change it in a way that is unpredictable.
And that's available, like our listeners can go on to capitalresearch.org and look at all that and dig into that.
The report is at capitalresearch.org, and it is The Myth of Nonpartisan Districts, an Experiment in Redistricting Reform.
I really appreciate your visit, Michael. Thank you so much. We're going to have to run here. We're out of time, but thank you so much again, capitalresearch.org. You have a great weekend.
Thank you very much. You too.
Ross McKintrick, and what happens to a climate scientist who raises his hand and said, no, there's not that extreme weather everyone says is going on, next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.